everyone, and welcome to one and all. Thanks for joining this panel discussion on improving access to financial services with better use of data. My name is Raman, and I will be your moderator today. Humans and machines are generating unprecedented amounts of data. It has been estimated that by the end of 2020, approximately 1.7 megabytes of data will be created every second for every human being on this earth. A large portion of this unprecedented amount of information are about individuals, their companies, their actions, how they interact with each other, and their preferences. This information has the potential to unlock powerful transformations in both the business and the retail world. We want to explore today on how we can harness effective usage of data to help previously underserved client segments, especially small and medium enterprises. How can data help financial inclusion, especially for providing credit and insurance to these segments? What have been the barriers and how can we overcome these? We have a very eminent panel of subject matter experts who will throw more light on some of these questions. It gives me great pleasure to welcome them. First, let me introduce Shamik Kundu. Shamik is the Chief Data Officer at Standard Chartered Bank and a member of the bank's Global Operations Management team. He plays a key role in shaping the bank's response to regulatory industry initiatives on data and artificial intelligence. Shamik is a thought leader on big data analytics and usage of data for innovation and is a regular contributor in industry forums. Welcome, Shamik. Warm welcome to Connie, Leung, Regional Business Lead of Financial Services for Microsoft Asia. In addition to her day job of developing and growing financial services across Asia Pacific, Connie has led various global initiatives around artificial intelligence, machine learning, and blockchain to enable industry-wide digital transformation. She's a regular speaker at industry events including Singapore FinTech, Hong Kong FinTech Festival, and similar events worldwide. Connie was named among the top 25 women leaders in Hong Kong FinTech in 2018. Thank you for joining us, Connie. And to complete our panel, it's my pleasure to welcome Mark Hookey, founder and CEO of DemystData. DemystData is the largest data solution provider in the world that offers external data as a service, EDAS solution. Their solutions harnesses external data from hundreds of data providers and data exchanges into a single platform to help banks and other financial institutions unlock access to data sets that can supplement their internal data. Their data helps their client to better acquire, onboard, and risk manage their clients, especially SMEs. Prior to founding DemystData, Mark was an MD with LexisNexis, New York. Welcome, Mark. Let me jump straight into the questions. Mark, tell us a bit more on why did you set up Demyst? What were the problems that you were trying to solve?
Thanks, PK. I think the preamble and introduction and title of this webinar actually summarizes it quite well: improving access to financial services through better use of data. We got very excited in the early days about the proliferation of external data in the ecosystem, but at the same time struck by the gaps in actual use of data. As it says in the title, the use of data. Why is it that large banks, large lenders, large insurance companies, healthcare providers, etc., why is it that for all of the information that's out there in the ecosystem, actually relatively little of it makes its way into helping end customers and automating and streamlining and improving processes? So that's why we started Demyst, was to bridge that gap between information supply and information use.
Thanks, Mark. Let me turn to Connie. Connie, how does a big company like Microsoft view the use of data? And what are you doing to help democratize data and its usage to help businesses, especially startups and SMEs?
Okay, first of all, thank you for having me. I think what we are seeing in the industry is the vision of becoming an intelligent-driven organization, or you call it data-driven organization. It's really about empowering the organization to have more data insights, to make smarter decisions and drive business outcomes. And connecting data across the organization is really important. From our perspective, as a technology provider, as our CEO rightly said, right, we wanted to empower every person, every organization on the planet to achieve more. So how do we do that? When you think about democratizing data, it's really trying to solve the data challenges within our customers' organization. We have so many data, but they're all sitting in different silo systems. So having accessibility for data is very important. The second thing about that is really to connect the data across organizations. So what we're promoting is talking about really creating a digital feedback loop, connecting the front, middle, and back office. And for that, I think as a technology provider, we need to provide a set of tools for our customers to use. So think about the cognitive services, NLP, the machine learning, cloud and database, and all of that. The idea is really for our customers to focus on financial services, for us to be their technology partner to provide those tools so that they can have the right use of data and the accessibility of data. You think about SMEs, right? I think there's many organizations that try to use alternative credit scoring, and that's another use of data and applying AI to that to be better serving the SME market. Well, for the startups and the partner ecosystems, basically Microsoft runs on a very large ecosystem for our partners. Our really mission is to empower them as well, right? To leverage our platform and technology to create solutions and platforms and to offer to the market. So for people like Mark, who's providing data, also for other traditional players or traditional solutions provider, we're actually doing risk management or customers engagements and even next best offer and personalizations. I think those are the partners and startups that we will empower them so that they can offer better service for our financial services customers.
Thanks, Connie. Let me turn to Shamik. Shamik, you have been a CDO of a large established traditional bank. How do you see the use of data in traditional financial institutions? And do you see it being used effectively to help transform lives?
That's a very leading question, but how do I see it used today? I think I see it used better than many outside the industry think it is. There's a huge amount that banks do with data, some of which might not be understood by those who are entering the industry or are outside the industry. In particular, banks have access to a huge amount of transactional information, which, with the permission of their customers, can and is used to deliver services, to prevent fraud, to prevent financial crime, to help people get better ideas for their investments, and so on and so forth. But the potential is much, much bigger. And I say that for two reasons. One, even within the context of the data that we banks have, we have not been doing enough. I think there's so much more we can do with our data. We've experimented a bit with that, not just us, most banks. Some of the reasons are regulatory. Some of the reasons are imagined regulatory, as in things that we think might cause issues. Some are just not being able to do it, and we can talk a little bit more about those barriers. But of course, the second one is where people like Mark come in, which is in addition to the very rich treasure trove of information that we have access to. There's also a lot more out there which should and can help us do more. And I don't think we are doing enough. But equally, I would go back to what I started with. Most people outside banks don't realize that actually banks do use information quite a bit in ways that most non-banking organizations might not have started.
Thanks, Shamik. I just want to delve into a little bit more of use cases and what is actually data being used. So again, let me go to Mark. Mark, have you come across some good examples where intelligent use of data has actually transformed either human experience for consumers or businesses? I mean, can you provide us a couple of use cases where this has actually become transformational?
Yeah, well, we're at this tipping point where through the proliferation of available information, through cloud services, through the maturing of AI, through digital innovation programs, they're all circling around actually getting organizations to use data to help customers. Some of the most common use cases that we're supporting with our clients are real-time automation of verification and KYC and AML processes, small business lending, various different versions of small business lending using external and internal data, insurance origination pre-fill, so asking as few questions as possible of the customer to kind of understand about their property, about their car, about themselves. Really, I would tie all of these together into a broader use case of digitization. Now, digitization can mean a lot of things to a lot of people, but effectively there's a consumer-led revolution happening at the end of all of this, which is people. Uber has taught us all that we should be able to press one button and get a product, and in times of COVID, Uber Eats has taught us that we can press one button and get some food, I guess. But the transition of the rest of the world following behind that, there's no reason why financial services should be more complex than that. Here I am, I'm Mark, or I'm a small business. I give you consent, permission, Mr. Bank, Mr. Insurer, to know more about me, but don't make me fill in 17 pages of application forms to know whether or not I tick every KYC checkbox and am creditworthy, and all of the same questions people have been asking about customers for a long time. But now we finally have the ecosystem that allows an institution to, again, as Shamik said, with consent, know who that customer is, offer them a product, accept them for the product, fulfill that product. So they're all they're all the types of use cases that we tend to get most involved in is customer product, customer information access to fulfill products digitally through the customer lifecycle, risk, KYC, verification, credit assessment, etc.
Thanks, Mark. So, Connie, Mark spoke about this wonderful tipping point where AI, cognitive computing, and machine learning can help transform how we use this data. What role does Microsoft play, or what are you seeing in marrying all these three together with the data, and how can they transform inclusion and financial inclusion?
Yeah, I think I echo a lot what Mark said. I think it really speaks to what we are seeing in the market as well. So, I mean, I go back to my earlier point about the digital feedback loop, right? I think there's a couple of things that I can illustrate here about how we see data and AI and how we all play a role actually in a larger ecosystem. So I would say the first thing is really differentiated customer experience. I think Mark talked a little bit more on that one. And I think the driver is really for the customer, like for people like ourselves, right? We don't give credit that financial services industry is regulated and you have compliance and strict requirements and securities. We don't give any of that empathy, right? I mean, we wanted the one button and one click to do all. I think that's where it's driving a lot of change. And with data and AI, I mean, when you say about digital feedback loop, right, you're connecting the front, middle, and back office. So we are talking about, people who are in the front, like RM, the relationship manager, the people in the call center, the people who are screening you, the loan process and approving and all of that. They need to be connected all through data. New energy of injecting everything into financial services. How do we connect the data to actually give you a differentiated customer experience? So that's 360-degree view of what happened. For example, very simple. If I'm actually calling now, like talking to you in a call center, you should know that I was doing an online browsing last night at home. You should know that I've done a physical branch visit somewhere, and you should also know that I bought an insurance product or whatever from your company, right? And I have a credit card or whatever. So I think that 360-degree view is not happening because it's not connecting the systems. So that's number one. The second thing I think is also looking at internal, particularly because of COVID. Many things are now pivoting to digital, right? Mark talked about digitalization, it's so true. So when you pivot to digitalization or digital, you actually have to get rid of all the physical element of it. All the paper forms, the manual processing that we used to happen at a branch or at a startup when you try and sell insurance. Those are gone, right? So how do you actually do automation intelligently? And that's really one thing that we're using data for, is instead of adding more headcount, because we don't have capacity, right? You can't add more people just because everybody's pivoting to online and nobody is visiting the branch. So you have to manage your human capital as well. So where data and AI actually helps is in the intelligent automation, is using those and also to create like self-service. A lot of things you don't have to be served. People doesn't want to be served, particularly new millennial, right? So self-service, and then how do you pivot the entire onboarding, what Mark said, from KYC. Right now you can use the cognitive services, you can use facial API, you can recognize who I am, validating against your state ID, we know who you are. So we have a lot of those tools and capability on data and AI that can automate the entire process. And the third one would be about transferring your product, right? How can I not using a one size fits all? Don't send me a standard brochure and say this is, the product I should offer to you. You should predict what I will be buying. You should look at my bank balance. You should know how much money I have spent to actually work on it, and then give me a personalized solution. And also not just me, right? Nudge me and give me an alert which is personalized to me, and not doing a blast call center or even outsource to somebody who can spell my name wrong, right? This is the most irritating part. You cannot even tell my name wrong, then what customer am I to you? So that's another one. The other one, which most people will kind of not or overlook, is the internal looking for employees, because we're all working in a COVID world. As I mentioned, we all know how to do online, we know how to look at the camera, and we know how to do the lighting and all of that. And we also work extremely long hours. So I think we also have a workplace analytics that allow, I would say, more of the organization to be empathic about how we're working in the COVID world, managing your time, your stress level, how much time you work overtime or office hour, and also how much time you spend on external meeting versus internal meeting. Can you benchmark all of that? So I think today technology needs to be embedded into everything you do in the digitalization. And it's more so for corporate world. So I think it's not just data and AI, but everything combined. The CRM has to be up to date. You need to be using cloud for agility. All of that has to be part of the digitalization.
Thanks, Connie. Shamik, before we get into the compliance and regulatory challenges, which we'll get into a minute, generally it's felt that the traditional players are not very good and the fintech players are the ones that are using a lot of external data. But what has been your experience in using external data to supplement internal data? And have you had any use cases where traditional finance players are starting to play in that?
I think it's worth starting with what happened with most of the alternate lenders once COVID-19 hit. I'm sure you've checked that many of them had to stop lending because their models didn't work, for example. So I think it's worth taking a lot of these things with a pinch of salt. Again, what do banks use data for? I'm not aware of a single part of the value chain that banks don't use data for. I think there's a difference between using the data we already have and using data that we don't have access to and can access from elsewhere. The latter we can come to as challenges. But in terms of where data is used across the value chain, every aspect that Market Connie talked about. So from authenticating customers while they're being onboarded to after they have been onboarded to the verification of their signatures if we still need physical verification. So all of the interfacing work with customers can and does use analytics. Then you get into growing your money. Absolutely. The investment ideas that come out is driven by data, both about your preferences, but also about, by definition, investment idea is based on a lot of data and analytics. Then you get, or if you get into robo-advisory or robo for advisors, that's another angle. Then you get into protecting your money, which is kind of keeping it safe. Fraud and cybersecurity is heavily dependent on lots of analytics use cases and scenarios, right? Then it goes to transferring your money. There, the use is not so much to help you. I mean, transferring your money is relatively simple from a physical movement perspective, but in terms of doing all the financial crime assessment underneath, all of that is heavily dependent on data and analytics. And the investigation part, at least, is also beginning to use AI, not so much the detection part, right? And then finally, borrowing, of course, that has been, people talk about how new players are using analytics models. You yourself have been a risk person in the past. What do you think a risk model is, if not a predictive model that is based on a lot of data? Yes, they are done with statistical techniques. There's a reason behind that. At the moment, there is a requirement. Most people outside banking don't necessarily understand that the way in which you decide how to lend to customers must be the way in which you calculate the capital that you put aside, right? Because of this equivalence, the latter, because that tends to be more well regulated, requires a higher bar, and we can come to that. But it is driven on data. So across, and then of course inside the bank's value chain, everything from automating trade finance document reading of that trade finance documents to extract the requirements. I'm not talking about robotic process automation here. I'm talking about just kind of using data and analytics to extract information, to automate or digitize processes, to help manage the workforce better, to help learning of staff better, to help assess misconduct issues like misbehavior of traders in terms of insider trading, etc. Across the chain, data and analytics is used heavily by banks. One count that we did recently identified 120 distinct use cases across the bank, where all of cross-sell in retail bank is one of those 120, just to give you an idea. So how many use cases are there? So it is used quite extensively, but it can be used much more with the right guardrails, with the right enablers, and also with the right investments in breaking down silos and improving portability.
Okay, thanks, Shamik. I just want to explore a little bit more on why, it's very clear, Mark, that data, both usage of external data plus internal data can really be transformative. What are the problems that you have seen that is actually inhibiting this even further? You mentioned in one of your LinkedIn posts about a global epidemic. You call it a global epidemic, which is the deficiency of data literacy as a key issue. What are the challenges in actually using data more effectively that you have come across once you've started rolling out Demys to the rest of the world? Yeah,
well, it could be used, as Shamik said, orders of magnitude more. Why isn't it? And why isn't it faster? whether we're talking about, we partner with some of the largest banks in the world, we partner with tiny fintechs and everybody in between. And whether you're in a small shop or a big shop, implementing this stuff is hard for a variety of reasons. There's real world blocking and tackling around things like third-party contracting and information security assessment of data partners and data vendors. How do you even do a POC with a data vendor? Well, you have to go and do diligence on them and sometimes their suppliers and sometimes their suppliers, and you have to look at things like consent. And so you've spent, some banks, some of our clients estimate they spend over $200,000 even to just execute a POC. And that's before you even know if the data has value or not. So it's like trading in used cars, but never being allowed to open the hood until you pay thousands of dollars to open the hood. So once organizations know that there's a there in the data, they can mobilize around it and implement. But just the process of discovery is so prohibitively expensive that a lot of people stay out of it. So that's one challenge that, we solve for by having a single contract and a single API and a single discovery engine, and others do as well. But it's so important to be able to, walk through the aisles of the supermarket and put food in the basket without paying lots of money to put the food in the basket until you get to the checkout, because you know what you want to order. And that sounds mechanical. There's that's the discovery problem. There's a problem around implementation as well. Every single data source and data process, whether it's internal or external data, has idiosyncratic semantics. It has some unique API, some unique batch data process, some unique set of some unique schema that has to be integrated and ingested in a certain way, some bespoke vendor-specific set of license use rights. Like we're often not talking about, sophisticated AI stuff here. We're talking about, fairly, sometimes basic mechanics of how do I verify addresses, but I want to do it from 3 sources, not 1, because that's what I have to do. So that semantic integration is key as well. And then there's a third bucket of challenge as well around, I'll call it tight coupling, which is institutions' processes become effectively hardwired to the data source itself. There's no agility, and over time it gets more and more complex. Shamik mentioned, I don't know if it's 120, 160 use cases across a bank. And every single one of those tends to go through a process of getting tightly coupled to a specific pot of data. Typically that's a specific vendor, but not always. But then, next year when the bank wants to add some extra data on top to make it even better, you end up with this compounding complexity problem of the cost of change. So the cost of change inside institutions is very, very hard. And data has this huge potential to be this incredibly low friction value delivery mechanism so that things actually finally do get done. But it's a very complicated ecosystem to navigate. That's where organizations need partners to help them get through it.
Thanks, Mark. Shamik, what is your perspective of barriers in using data and AI more effectively? I guess you can add to the problems that Mark had said from your perspective.
So first of all, Mark and I are often we've often exchanged emails and spoken about these topics. So I'm fully aligned with Mark on these pieces. We've often looked at what potential solutions could come up with. I would say there are 5 sets of barriers. The most important one is the one you started with, the cultural one, right? When you don't have data literacy, and in the broadest sense of the word, people will either get scared or even worse, overexcited about its potential, right? I say even worse because I've had so many people just getting super excited about why aren't we doing everything possible that every fintech out there supposedly is doing, etc. I think that's dangerous, right? I always ask people, if you think of the word bank being used in a verb sense, what do you say? You can bank on that. What does that mean? You can trust that. A bank is nothing. And I say this to AMTD as they try and set up a bank here. A bank is nothing if it doesn't have trust. With all due respect, a Demys can or a Microsoft or a Google or a Facebook has greater scope to lose and regain trust compared to a bank, right? Because they are a bank. The very word is meant to be trust, right? Now, with that starting point, there is a huge amount of fear as well as lack of awareness. So when you combine those two things, the very high bar on trust, people say it's regulatory, it's compliance, it's none of that. As a bank, it is in our DNA to say we have to keep our clients' data and money safe. It is absolutely in our DNA. We get obsessed with this much more than any other industry. And that obsession is not bad. In an environment where everybody is worried about privacy and ethics, etc., that obsession is, in my view, an unmet customer need, right? Every bank should endeavor to build upon that. Every fintech should build that, because that's the source of your trust. Eventually, people should use banks to bank their data rather than their money. So if you start with that, banks need to become much more aware of the risks and the ways of dealing with those risks around data. And that doesn't happen. And that is the biggest barrier, I would say. Of course, there's a large number of regulatory compliance kind of barriers, yes, but they're not insurmountable. Particularly in our footprints, we found Hong Kong, Singapore, there's a lot of India, there's a lot of very helpful regulation that is forcing people to open up their data in a safe way. And so data portability, privacy, all of this actually can help. In the absence of these guidelines, we have to go and guess what is possible. It's much better to have these guidelines, whether it's on AI or ethics or privacy. So I think regulatory or compliance issues are there, but to call them barriers would be wrong. To call them things we must build guardrails around is appropriate, but I don't see them as negative barriers. I just see them as an essential way of making progress. So cultural and reputational compliance, regulatory, these are some of the things to overcome. But then you have some more mechanical ones, as Mark mentioned. So the mechanics of taking external data work and external data and internal data and making it work jointly is quite tough. I've had an instance myself where Barclaycard or one of the cards, I don't know which one it was in India, after they left India, their collection agency decided that I, as Shamik Kundu, was the same Shamik Kundu who had a 9,000 rupee loan unpaid, except I was out of the country for 10 years by the time. And for 24 hours, I was hounded by a debt collector until I finally spoke to somebody in Pune police and said I'm being hounded inappropriately because somebody had done a match on Shamik Kundu and just had assumed this public Shamik Kundu is the one to go after. So it can be very tricky if you're just combining external and internal data. Never mind doing purely on internal data. So that's challenges. That's just one kind of mechanical challenge. There is functional challenge. It is often said that many of these companies that sell, credit scores, etc., they don't necessarily use it to lend on their own book. And so, you have to be, and during this crisis, it's become particularly obvious that the algorithms and the models that you build using new kinds of data need to be stress tested, and they need to be continuously stress tested, and their tires need to be kicked. So how you use that data also needs to be good. It's not just let's get the data and use it for something. We have to have reliable ways of using it. And then finally, the data. I mean, let's not forget that the bar again on banks is very high. Connie started off by mentioning, KYC, or not Connie, I think Mark started by mentioning, KYC, I'm Mark Hookey, you got my data, why do you need to fill it out? And Mark, you gave the example of Uber. Guess what? Uber was twice called out in the UK, I think, and in many other geographies for doing poor KYC on their drivers. And in the case of the UK, they lost their license, but the court put in a stay on it. And I think now, I don't know the latest stay on that. Now, imagine if a bank in the UK or Singapore or Hong Kong was called out for saying not doing KYC sufficiently, like not fit for purpose. Could we be allowed to continue to do business? And yet Uber was. Why? Because the stakes are lower. The stakes of getting a driver on board or a customer on board is lower than the stakes of trusting somebody with their entire life savings. So as a result, what constitutes acceptably good quality data for us is much higher and should be higher, not just for us, but for anybody else who's trying to offer financial services or healthcare for that matter.
I think that's a great example. The interesting addition to that is, there's situations where banks also have an obligation to know more about customers. What happens when banks get called out for not looking at LinkedIn and seeing that borrower just lost their job? by fair lending, they arguably do have that obligation. So it goes, banks really do have this deep duty, you're right, to know their customers inside and out and not mismatch them as that example exacerbates.
Yeah. So I think these are, to your question, these are all barriers, but I don't think these are insurmountable barriers. In fact, I think calling them barriers somehow, I think gives them a negative connotation, at least in some of them, not the technical challenges, etc., but some of the challenges around how to be, fairer than fair, if you will, and really ethical and really respect the trust that people give to banks or to insurers or to new financial services firms like yours, PK. I think those are good things. Ultimately, the story of our time is not a lack of trust in banks. I'm sorry, that was a story from 1 or 2 decades ago. The story of our times is a lack of trust in people who deal with our data and do things with it. And if anybody is well placed to deal with that, it is people who are in financial services, or for that matter, perhaps in healthcare. I mean, anything else which is a matter of much more than trust doing an ad or sending you an offer, which is financial services or healthcare or insurance, things like that. Those players have the opportunity to use all this external data, but to use it in a way that actually becomes a source of competitive advantage, not because I'm selling more, not because I've got 2 more customers, but because people trust us more to deal with that data than they would with others.
Thanks, Shamik. That's a very robust defense. And I think it's very clear on some of the challenges. I just want to pick up on one of the points that Shamik had earlier raised on the COVID has, which the black swan event and once in 100 years event, has actually make the models that some of the fintechs using irrelevant. And Connie, I just want to turn to you on using of historical models and external data sets comes with challenges if they're not properly tested for the whole cycle. Right? What do you think needs to change if we were to go effectively to use a lot more data to make decisions if they don't look at? So, I mean, COVID is probably once in 100 years, but what do you think are the challenges in using data without proper testing?
I think that's, the Mark and Shamik has speak a lot about the data part. I think the key thing about data is really what you're going to do and use those data for, and I think what are the challenges you try to solve about, rather than looking at historical models and whether they work or not. And I think COVID is a very good example of that, right? So if you think about how you, for example, it's not about what the data that you have. Sometimes it's really about what data that you need to try and do some business or make changes. And I give you an example of that. Like even before COVID, right? We have done a project with National Australia Bank for an ATM. Traditional, ATM card has been fraud. So when you think about how do I manage or how do I reduce fraud for an ATM card? And for people who used to work in the environment with legacy systems and think about what data you have, you just keep on, improving the MaxRep card and see how I can do more pins and whatever security measures. But if you totally recreate that model and think about if I have to re-engage with a customer with no legacy, I'm not talking about, acting or actually being a fintech, but I'm actually acting like a fintech or a startup. How will I look at that particular business and transform that? So we did a project by saying that, okay, what do I need if I wanted to do an ATM function for my customer? And ultimately what you need is me. You need the customer. And how do you identify me? Me, right? So I go to the ATM machine, I use my face, I look at my facial API, I have my record pre-stored, and I enter my PIN and I'm done. So that's how you reduce fraud. So when I think about whether the traditional model works or not, maybe you shouldn't start looking at it that way. You should look at it as, if I have to culturally transform, this is really, innovation is not just about technology. Innovation is about transforming how you look at things, how you re-engage, what's the ultimate goal of having customer centricity first, and then looking at data second. So I think that's just one example. The other example I was drawing on earlier was about the KYC. Shameek and Mark talked about it, right? In COVID, we have to do the entire digital onboarding because there's no choice. We're all interacting, digitally now. There's no physical interaction. I don't even want you to deliver a package at my doorstep, COVID, right? I don't want to be infected. So for that matter, you have to think about how do I authenticate you? Do I look at a utility bill? Do I have to look at a utility bill? Can I just, as I say, validate my Say ID with my facial API and my facial recognition and then look at it? So that's another one that I can actually do a better job and then continue that with authentication. I can do what I'm doing now with wholesaling and showing you all my products and sharing my screens. I can do my e-form, so everything can be digitally captured. I can do my e-signature, and then there you go, you finish your end-to-end onboarding. and the selling process digitally. And those are the data that you may not capture in your traditional way. And those are the data that you need to do. So as I said, I don't want to think about algorithm as a starting point. I want to think about how I want to collect the data and where do I collect the data. And can that data come from external sources? People like Mark that can help me do that. Another piece I wanted to touch on is there are a lot of data that we don't use and we don't analyze. And I think that is something that we as a technology provider, we can help solve that problem. So I'll give you an example of conversation AI. I'm having a conversation with you, I'm having a conversation with your relationship manager, I may have a lot of conversation with the bank in the call center. Most often, those conversations are recorded, but they're not analyzed. Maybe 10% of them are analyzed just for compliance checking. But now, with the technology that we come up with, we can actually analyze 100% of those conversations, and we will drill into analytics and tell you, first of all, do you want to be listening or are you talking mostly? You want to benchmark your person, your salespeople, who they are and how they work with the customers. You can benchmark that. How often do you listen versus how often you sell? And the one who actually listen more is a better performance. The second piece, which is quite interesting, is sentiments. Are you having more happy customers at the end of the call, or you're having more so happy customers at the end of the call? Those are the data that we can give you, and those are the data that is readily available with tools that can allow you to have a better insights and better use of data. So I would say start from what problem you're trying to solve and find a way of, is that an algorithm that will help you solve it, or is it not an algorithm that help you solve it? I think that's really the mindset that we have to change, is don't bring your legacy to innovation. That's the barrier. Innovation needs to be, if I have nothing, what will I do? And then think about, okay, what is the trust that I have to build? And I absolutely agree with you, Shamik. We have to build a technology that people will trust. They will not use a technology they don't trust. So I and you have the same bar. We have the same high bar. We cannot live with behind that or below that. But I think as a brand from our financial services industry, we have a very good branding. But we haven't been very good in using data and smartly in the way of how you should capture data, most often like LinkedIn. You should capture LinkedIn because you want to be part of the live events of a customer. Like, you want to know that I'm buying a house. You don't want to wait for me to walk to the branch and ask for a mortgage proposal. You want to know that I'm stuck in a certain location with COVID, or I'm actually sent back home because I'm not traveling overseas for extensive time. You need to know that live event so that you can tailor for me and you can personalize the service for me. So those are another data feed that come from what I call a trusted source that you can monetize the data and actually be a better serve your customer in the live event. So I think those are the things that we are seeing changing, and that's the whole mindset that needs to change.
Okay. I think looking at the problem and trying to solve and looking at what we can use, that's a great insight. I just want to turn to some solutioning. Shamik, if you were to advise a CDO on 2 or 3 things that they should do to start using data more effectively, either internal or external, what would that be? Take a couple of minutes because I think we're going to be, we have about 4 or 5 minutes.
Yeah, I'll actually give just one piece of advice, and it builds on Connie's piece. Don't start with the data. Start with the problem you're trying to solve. Is it adding SME, allowing SME clients to do business better with you? Is it improving trade finance? Is it improving customer 360 view? Take that problem and, as you say, start from Z to come back to A, rather than starting with, I've got a lot of data, what can I do with it? That's my one piece of advice.
Thanks. Mark, what would be your advice to CEOs and business leaders who want to gain insights using data, but they're frustrated currently that they're unable to do so quickly and at scale? What are the steps they could take to start leveraging data more effectively to help their customers?
Well, beyond working with players like us, the one piece of advice I'd give is really just sitting down and being clear about what to insource versus outsource. It's a conversation not many people, people have it obviously in the context of BPO, but does it really make sense for institutions to have their own dedicated team of people doing discovery, doing contracting, building BI tools, building AI tools, building cloud systems, building workflows, building models, building the algorithms? Maybe some of those things are crown jewels IP that must be internal. Everything else, really, our advice should be really clear about it being deliberately external. Most enterprises have this sort of generic view of just, well, everything's sort of IP, and so everything's going to be internally, and they end up doing a mediocre job of quite a few of those things. So that's the one piece of advice, is drawing that boundary of like what's build, what's buy, nothing in between.
Thanks. I think that's great insight. Connie, I just want to turn to you on what role do you see regulators playing across industry in terms of data sharing? Is there a role where regulations can help transform this faster?
Yeah, I think the regulators definitely take a role. I think for the past few years that I've seen, digital transformation has been going on in our industry. A lot of time regulations, because they're playing the supervision role, one thing is really what we're driving is modernizing regulations, right? You need to be able to enable and empower our industry to adopt the modern technology, which is like cloud, data and AI, even blockchain and others. The other thing I think regulation can really play a good role is driving innovation in our industry, like Singapore MAS, Hong Kong Shameek, where they have these fintech offices and the sandbox, and I think that create a safe environment that you're allowed to fail. I mean, if you think about our financial service industry, right? We have a lot of trust and brand in our industry, but failing is a hard work to absorb for our industry. But I think the innovations and the regulations is driving is allowing us to learn and fail, not that you fail forever, but you learn and fail fast, and then you actually improvise and improve on it. The key thing is innovation or intelligent organization is a continuous journey. Nobody is done with it. And data is the same thing. Nobody is done with data. You have whatever data you have, you try and optimize the use of data and be more intelligent. The more data you have, you be more intelligent. So that mindset and that continuous improvement has to be injected in our industry. And I think regulators have a long role to play on that one.
Thanks. We're coming to the end of the session. So I just want to ask each one of you to just future gaze and tell me in the next 5 years from now, what would you see? What's a world view that you have in terms of data and data? One thing that you think you can predict. I'll start with Mark, then with Shamik, and then finally.
When in the early days of building models or doing BI, technology brought down the barriers to entry by many orders of magnitude. People didn't just take that as cost savings. The net effect was they just did more of it. They did more analytics, they built more models. Data will be the same. The barrier to entry goes to as close to zero as you can imagine, but it'll be about the right data solving the right customer problems. But testing and deploying data will be something that gets done every day, not every year, which is what often happens now. And it will be sometimes reactive, sometimes proactive, but it will be the moving boundary of competitive dynamics, and it will be a much more competitively rivalrous environment to capture and win customers, and that will be for society and the customer's benefit.
I think we'll solve bigger problems. I think we'll solve problems like how do you do environmental, social investing reliably. We'll solve problems like how do you allow SMEs and small businesses to get access to finance in a way they can't do today. You'll solve problems like macroeconomic stability, early warning signals for the entire industry. I don't think we're solving the biggest problems with data yet.
Thanks, Shamik. Connie, final words?
Yeah, I think very well said. I think to me, change is going to be continuous. I think what COVID has brought to us is change is good for the first time, because our industry is so risk averse. I think now doing nothing is not acceptable. I think change is everything. And to Shamik's point, I think data, we used to say core banking is core to our business. I would say data is core to any business. Connecting data across industries, ecosystem, as what Shamik said, is going to be, I would say, BAU. You'll see more data connected in the future. It has become natural.
Thank you. Can't wait for that world. I'd like to thank Mark, Shamik, and Connie. Thank you so much. I wish we had more time. It's a fascinating topic, but I think I've learned quite a lot, and thank you so much for your participation, and hope to see you soon again, physically sometime soon. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.
Bye-bye.